Hi there, I'm Shauna Lake with Deep End Talent Strategies and the Deep End Job Search. I'm a human resources consultant for small businesses and a career coach for individuals looking to make a career change. I am excited to share some information with you today about interviewing. These are some tips that I've seen successful job seekers do to land new jobs and come in prepared to nail the interview. So, we're going to talk about some ways to be prepared for the interview and then how to take notes and make sure that you've covered the things you intended to cover while you're answering the questions and the nerves tend to take over, how to keep yourself organized and stay in control of those nerves. So let's dive in briefly. When you go in prepared for the interview, obviously have a couple copies of your resume, and then also take the job description, have it printed out, and have some markups to show that you have gone through it thoroughly, had a chance to check off the things that you know you can do, that you're confident you can do well, and the experiences you have. Maybe mark some things that you have some questions about that weren't clear to you, or some gaps, and be prepared to answer questions about the job description. And when I say go into the interview, historically that would be in-person interviews, which are still happening today, but there are more and more virtual interviews. So this actually becomes a little bit easier if this is a phone interview or even a virtual video interview, because you can glance down at your notes and be a little bit more inconspicuous. But in an in-person interview, it is still perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's actually questionable if you don't go in with notes and showing your homework a bit and showing that you're prepared, because it shows that you are serious about this opportunity, that you have really tried to imagine yourself in the role and what it would take to be successful in the role, and that you want to work there as much as you're hoping that they want to work with you. So going in without anything and without showing that preparation will actually not be in your favor in the interview. So a lot of times people will ask me if it looks like they're nervous if they have some notes prepared or some questions pre-written. And in fact, I'm like, no, that's great. That's exactly what you should do. So your resume, the job description, showing the markup so they can actually visibly see how much time and thought you've put into this. Have a notebook or something to write with, and 2 pens, because if you're like me, Murphy's Law is one of them. Even if it's brand new, is going to stop working in the middle of the interview. We've all been there, done that. So have at least 2 pens or pencils. Have some questions prepared in your notebook of the questions that you have for them, because hopefully they will give you a chance at the end to ask questions. But if an interview goes really well, you can turn it into an interesting conversation where you may be able to ask questions during the interview. So they'll ask a question, you will answer it, and then you end your response with a question back that's related to what they asked you. This truly becomes a conversation, and I call it playing like a game of ping pong in the interview. You can't always get away with that if it's a very structured interview and your interviewers have a questionnaire where they have to go through every question and they have to document your answers. They may not want to play ping pong with you. It could get them off track. But especially if it's a one-on-one interview and it can be more of a casual conversation, it'll be a conversation that I'm much more likely to remember and remember fondly. So try to have some questions that you want to ask of them, either when you have your turn at the end or as you can move them into the conversation. And those questions should be about the role, so job specific questions, what it's like to work there, the culture, the leadership, the team. I always like to know why a position is open. Is it new? Is it a replacement? What maybe has caused someone to not be successful in that role in the past? And on my blog and my website, you can find additional information about sample questions to ask. And I'm happy to point you in the right direction if you want to reach out to me on social media. And then have a list. This is the key takeaway for today. Have a list of your accomplishments and stories that you hope to get a chance to tell them. And if you have ever had like an open notes test in high school or college or even junior high, you sometimes get an index card where you can like put all your formulas and you can fill it and write in your tiniest little pencil print. You can really do that going into an interview as well. And this works beautifully. So have some shorthand phrases or stories or examples, not the full story written out, just a couple of words that at quick glance, you can look down at your piece of paper and look at it and say, oh yeah, I wanted to tell the story about that process improvement effort or that difficult customer that I was able to turn that around. And so have those whatever phrase or keywords that at quick glance will jog your memory so that you can tell the story. And let's go into why that becomes helpful. So when you're asked a question during the interview, it is perfectly acceptable for you to take notes of the question they asked, to write it down for 3 reasons. One, you're showing your engagement, but do this in shorthand. If you take 5 minutes to write it out verbatim, you're kind of wasting time. But so you're showing your engagement. The second is that when you are answering the question, you can tick it off to keep yourself on track that you have successfully answered the question. When our nerves take over, we have a tendency to answer the question and then keep talking and keep repeating ourselves and saying the same thing over and over. It projects a lack of confidence, but it also just takes valuable time out of the interview. And if you can answer a question succinctly and then get the ping pong ball back on their side of the net, figuratively, then you get another chance to ask another question, and they learn more about you and you learn more about them. So you want to answer a question well, but concisely and as quickly as you can, so that you can keep the conversation moving. So putting a little tick mark next to the question as you've answered it helps you psychologically say, yep, I'm done, I'm ready to move on. The third thing it does by writing down the questions that they've asked is that you can be prepared. You can start building a library of the questions you're receiving in this job search, so you can be more prepared for the next interview. And when you go to write your thank you email, you will be able to reference some of the questions that were asked. If you felt like there was something else you wanted to add, you wished you would have said, this is a chance to fill in some of those gaps through the thank you process or some follow-up conversations. So keeping a list of the questions that have been asked is great. It is okay to ask for clarification on a question. If you aren't sure, or you just want to check for your understanding to make sure that an example you have prepared is going to meet their expectations, it is okay to ask a clarifying question about a question. A question about a question. And then the value of having your notes prepared in advance of the stories that you want to tell and your past accomplishments is that you can quickly glance down at them, look for one that matches the context of the question that's been asked, and then put a tick mark next to it, a check mark next to it, to indicate that you've already used that story. When we're nervous, we have a tendency to have a recency factor in our minds. The story we just told, especially if it was well received in the interview and they were nodding and they seemed to like our example, then that kind of sticks in our brain. And when we get another question, it's hard to think about a different example because that one went so well, it's kind of our go-to. Then you end up not sharing the full breadth of your knowledge and experience. So put a check mark next to it and try to avoid going back to the same one. Next time you get a question, glance down and look for another example, another accomplishment that you can phrase in the way that's going to answer the question and how they asked the question. You want to check for understanding of your answers. If you can do that by seeing their nonverbal expressions, that is the best way to do it, which is difficult if it's over the phone. But if it's a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, or if it's in person, you can hopefully look and see if they're making eye contact. Are they nodding? Do they seem like they're in agreement and they're following along with your example? If they're taking notes, just pause until they get a chance to look back up at you. If they seem puzzled, then you may need to redirect or ask if there's an opportunity to share more information. But there are different strategies you can use for how you check for understanding if you need to do that verbally. If you say it in the way, in terms of, does that answer your question? That can actually seem a little condescending if you get the tone wrong. If you say, I hope that answers your question, it seems a little less confident. So a better way to ask if it answers their question is to say, is there anything else I can tell you about that story? Or please let me know if you would like to hear a little bit more about that specific situation. So you're inviting them in, you're confidently saying, I have more to tell you. I could keep going. if that's something you would want. And then they may say, oh no, that's great. Thank you. We'll move on. Or they may come back and say, I'm actually not sure I understand your original answer. Can you explain this further? And then you didn't fully answer their question. You can go back and do that. But you have said that in a confident tone versus, I hope that helps. I hope that answers your question, because that doesn't come across as confident. Now, it's the strategy, the ping pong strategy would be when it makes sense and if they're willing to play along, when they've asked a question of you, for you to try to ask a question back that's related to what they asked you. For example, if the question was, tell me about the last book you read, or how do you stay current on our industry? Answer the question and then perhaps say, what is the organization's philosophy on continuing education? Or how does the organization view or prioritize professional development? You get an opportunity to learn something. Maybe it's a question that was actually on your original list to ask them, and it fits nicely into the conversation here. If they're willing to answer, you're starting to have a conversation. It's not a boring Q&A interview. And they're going to remember that you're a good conversationalist, that you're warm, that you're thoughtful, that you have good questions. Now, again, not everybody can do that. Some interviews have to follow a certain pattern and it's very rigid. And if you try that once and they're not playing along, don't push it. You don't want to make it uncomfortable. But when you can get that great dialogue going, you can play that ping pong, they will remember that conversation above all of the others. So when you can ask a question back, I highly recommend that. If not, you can answer the question and you can sit quietly and wait for the next question. Or you can check for understanding, but do so in a way that's confident. Can I tell you more about that? Would you like to hear more about this? Or would you like to hear more about my software experience? And then they will either say yes or no, and they'll continue to be in the driver's seat of the conversation if that's their approach. But I hope that helps you to get an idea of how you can go into an interview with notes prepared, that it is okay to have notes. It's actually preferred, and that you can take notes during the interview as well. You can ask the questions that have been asked. You can check off the fact that you've answered them. You can check off your story so you make sure you're not repeating yourself, but you also can make sure that you get to share all the things that you wanted to share about your experiences and your background. And then you can turn that boring Q&A into more of an engaging conversation. So good luck in your job search process and your interview process, and connect with me on social media if I can help with any additional information or job search tips. There is a ton of information available on our social media channels and on our blog about interviewing. So best of luck. Thank you.